It has been said by many that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I also believe beauty is in the eye of the Creator. It is up to the Maker to create that inner vision for the many to behold. For the Maker, creation of this beauty is the ultimate journey. I believe my journey has begun. Well, how was that for a cheesy, dramatic intro? I've always wanted to do one of them. Hi folks, I'm Dan and you found Therapy Woodworks, a wild and crazy YouTube channel where we sometimes have a lot of fun and even sometimes learn a little bit about woodworking. Some of you may or may not know I am a bit of an audiophile. I've got a pretty wicked cool stereo system in the house that pounds pretty hard and shakes the house. I had one issue. Some of my speakers were still sitting on the floor, and amongst audiophiles that's a no-no. So I had to build myself some speaker stands. I'm really proud of these. They turned out very nice and I would consider them beautiful. I learned a lot in the process of designing and building these speaker stands. So come and join me in the journey and I'll show you how I did it. First off was a trip to the local lumber store for some maple and black walnut. I've used this combination in the past and really like the contrast. I then set about my design process, which consists of physical cutouts and drawings with dimensions using an actual pencil and paper. Once I have an idea of what I am creating, I head to the miter saw to cut boards to rough length, both walnut and maple. So I end up with a pile of rough cut boards. At the joiner, I carefully assess grain direction and warpage of each board so I can make one face flat. Once I have a flat face, it is easy to create a square and true edge. Now that I have a flat face and a square edge, I can rip the boards on the table saw so that the two edges are parallel to each other. This is easily achievable by placing the flat face down and the jointed edge against the face of the fence. A trip to my lunchbox, a trip to my DeWalt planer to complete the flattening process will bring all the boards to S4S condition or square 4 sides. I can't wait to get some helical heads for this planer as it sure produces a lot of high decibel noise. And I've heard that helical heads cut down on that noise. No project is complete with at least one glue up. And if you've watched any of my previous videos that include glue ups, which is most of them, then you will know it's not my favorite part of woodworking. But I do love the smell of wood glue in the morning, right Tanya? I apply and smear glue all over the edges to be joined, and a little all over me just for good measures. I lined up the boards paying attention to the triangle pencil marks I placed earlier in the dry fit process. With all the boards lined up, I can apply some clamping pressure with added clamps as I need them to ensure overlap of the 45-degree pressure zones. I elected not to use dominoes to ensure flatness of the panels, so I will use wood cauls and clamps to keep the boards aligned. After drying overnight, I cleaned up the remaining glue with a Veritas carbide tip scraper and flattened the board seams with a Veritas card scraper and holder. This will be sufficient, as I will now be ripping all of the walnut boards to a final width for both short and tall stands on the table saw. According to my design, the shorter stands will be used on the front speakers, which have a larger base than the taller rear speakers. The speaker stand bases and tops can take a final run through the planer, as they are less than 13-inch maximum capacity of the planer. Man, I'm pretty quick at that, don't you think? Back to the table saw, where I get to use my slider attachment to cut walnut tops and bottoms to their final length. I can't sing the praises of having this slider attachment on the table saw loud enough. I realize you can achieve the same cross-cutting tasks on a cross-cutting sled, but the slider table sure saves me time, as I don't have to go through the setup process every time. It's always ready for use. Here to take you through Dan's design process. As some of you may or may not know, I am a reference designer, meaning that I like to have physical pieces of things that I can look at. My design for the speaker stands is that I want to have a curved laminated piece that joins both the bottom and the top section. So these curved laminated pieces are going to be of two different materials. They are going to be two outer pieces of maple, with sandwiched in between the two layers of maple, there will be a layer of black walnut. So something like this. I kind of like it. How do I design that curved shape that I want? By actually putting the top and the bottom on the bench and taking cardboard and cutting it out to the dimensions that I have, then just looking at it and drawing the curve on it that I want. And so I end up with a cardboard template of a curved piece that I find aesthetically pleasing. It's a lot better. I can hold on to this and I can twist it and turn it and I can see how it looks. So what I'm going to do from there is I'm going to transfer this shape onto a piece of material, a template piece of the fiber chipboard, which then I will be able to keep forever, and I will use that as a template to transfer to the solid leg pieces. Once I transfer the shape of the cardboard cutout to the template board, I further refine it using various tools such as French curves and straight edges. At the bandsaw, I can cut out the template to transfer it to the black walnut and maple boards. It is a fairly time-consuming task to cut out all of the spar boards. I will be laminating 3 boards for each of the 4 spars. So if you're good at math, then you already figured out that I have to cut out 12 boards very intricately. Good lighting and a dark pencil were my friends in the process. Actually, I used a light pink pencil on the walnut to contrast, as the contrast was way easier to see. Although I think I was seeing double by the end of the process. Good thing I got 4 eyes. As I would learn later, it is very important to get as close as you can to the line without going over. And there you have the long and short of it, and can start to see my vision of beauty. And now for glue up number 2. Forget the little squeeze bottle, let's just pour it on and make a heap big dripping mess. Lots of glue for lots of contact surface, all spread out nice and even. This time it was a very simple glue up. Just keep adding clamps until there's glue squeezing out of everywhere. I sure love my quick grip clamps, particularly the metal ones from Dubuque. A quick trip to the bandsaw to trim up any larger bits hanging off, then I can get to the most enjoyable part of this project, forming with hand tools. I have to admit, I have not used my hand tools too extensively as of yet, and have been looking forward to a project where I could take the time and explore them. My planes are nothing to write home about, as they need a refurbish, but my son acquired them for me and tuned them up just enough to get by for this project. This is also the first project I decided to use card scrapers, and I have to tell you, I am mighty impressed by the finish that was left by both the scrapers and the planes. Hardly any sanding will be required. I got two of the spars done, one of the tall ones and one of the short ones. I made these primarily by hand, so by using various hand tools, spoke shaves, cards. Because I want to replicate the first spars that I did by hand, I created some templates. So I used a flush trim bit to make this template, which exactly matches the profile of the piece that I formed by hand. So as a departure, I want to do the next set. So I got two more to make. I'm going to use a technique that I've been wanting to try, and that is by using a flush trim router bit and this template as a guide. So what that will do, it will exactly reproduce the first one onto the second set. I'm going to try two methods with this. I'm going to try using the flush trim router bit on the router table over there, and I'm also going to try using a flush trim router bit on my little palm. I elevated the spars in a series of clamps for ease of access to hand trimming with the palm router. Then using the bottom bearing straight cut bit, I could carefully navigate the bearing against the guide template on top of the dog pile. Without disturbing the alignment of the template, I relocated the clamping system to the center of the spar so I could trim up the ends on both the front and back of the spar. This method was quick and went surprisingly well. Let's try it on the router table, as my palm router is a little underpowered. This is where the trouble began. The first pass went okay using the same bottom bearing straight cut bit, as there are not much material to remove. The next pass using an 1.5 inch top bearing bit got a little hairy. You can see I left a fair bit of material on the spar during the bandsaw process, and I was unavoidably cutting against the grain. I should have stopped here. I knew something was not right. Large chunks and a lot of chatter. One more try. Crap! And I walk away in disgust. Completed the machining process using the two different methods. One by hand using my hand planes and card scrapers and spoke shaves. The second one where I used the flush trim bits, both with an upper and a lower bearing. And I have to tell you, not only was it way more fun forming the shape by hand and watching it and develop and grow, and I can make changes on the fly, and you end up with such a beautiful finish. This was quick, simple, and easy using the pattern, but it's a mess. I still have a lot of handwork to do, a lot of sanding, a lot of forming, a lot of shaping, because there's a lot of marks in it. And at one point, the terrible part about it is that because the router bit turns only one way, and sometimes you have to push the material into the router bit against the grain, which is not really a good thing to do, because as you can see, it can tear out a nasty chunk. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. I mean, if this was For a customer, I would be throwing this in the garbage and making another one. I think I'm going to put a little bit of filler in there because if I was to try and thin this down anymore, it just wouldn't look right. But that is what learning woodwork is all about. Learning from boo-boos. I have learned to make multiple passes and not remove too much material in one go. I am now adding a large coving to the front of the spars with decorative trim, but we'll be doing this in 4 passes to complete the process. This is the result of an experimental full cut. Nasty. So I took my time, and even though I had to make climb cuts against the grain at times because of the direction of the cutter spin, all worked out well. It helped using the fence to brace the spar on initial contact with the router bit. The back side of the spar received a 1/4 inch round over instead of a cove. I wanted to add a bit of asymmetry to the piece. There were no issues with this process either. With all of the machining completed on the spars, it was time to turn attentions back to the tops and bases of the stands. I have a trim piece in mind that would have allowed for a maloof joint as I originally designed for the project, but when I drew the joint on paper, I realized that the contrasting colors of the maple and walnut would look goofy as a maloof joint. I still wanted to incorporate the trim pieces as I believe it would add a certain elegance to the piece. That was close call. These trim pieces were getting to be a little on the small and fragile side, so I decided to do a 45-degree trim on the table saw prior to completing another cove cut on the router table. I adjusted the router table precisely in line with the router bearings so the fence would give good support to the material. With the 45-degree cuts in the trim pieces, I was able to run the pieces through the router in one pass without any tearing out of material. Even a full cut in the end grain worked out well, with only a few burn marks to deal with later. I did so well with the trim pieces, I decided to give a full thickness cut to the bases and tops. I was flirting with disaster, but I find the walnut much hardier and more resistant to tear out. Dodged a bullet, and the outcome was perfectly fine. First thing you gotta do, got a little plane here. There's a little burr on the back from the hole that I created. So I gotta clean that up so that this piece sits flush on that piece. And I've got all of the lines lined up. I know exactly where this needs to go. I have a center line on here and a center line on there. Plenty of glue, staying 3 millimeters from the edge. The good Canadian that I am, I know my metric system. Prefer using the metric system because it's much easier to divide by 10 than 30 seconds or 60/4 or whatever it is. Line up the marks. Make sure we're all sitting in the right spot. And I'm going to take the first one. Set up, it has probably set up just a little bit. mount it on top of the other one. Set the clamp in as deep as I can with not much force. Just gonna put a little F clamp on here. Doesn't need much pressure because I don't want to warp the wood. That's it, we're glued up. Bravo. The last bit of machining I have to do is add the mortise and tenon type of joint to the spars, bases, and tops. I drew the angles on the spars that I wanted, making sure the short stands had a 5-degree rack for proper sound registration in the room. I then transferred this angle to the miter jig referencing the dado blades. Getting some of the angles transferred took some ingenuity as there was no straight section on the bottom of the spars. I used the table saw fence as a straight edge to extrapolate the correct angle and again transfer that to the miter jig. I didn't want to have to repeat this process, so I was sure to note the angles where I could easily refer to them. Setting the depth of cut was done by referencing the actual piece. With everything set, I could make some cuts to create a tenon. I've never used a miter gauge in this fashion and was a little apprehensive, but it worked very slick. I really had little choice to do it this way as there was only one truly straight edge on the spar to reference to the miter gauge. Multiple passes to hog out the rest of the material was a simple task. And we have a tenon. To establish a depth of cut for a visible through tenon, I used calipers to again directly reference the spar and set up the blade for the appropriate depth of cut. I know this was a large cut that I could have done in multiple passes, but what is life without a little bit of risk and danger? I have everything well clamped and backed, and I am well away from the spitting mass of flush shredding carbide. It was a pretty slow and methodical cut though. Sanding for the most part on the sides of these beams is pretty straightforward. I'm starting out with 150 grit, progressing to 220 grit. There was a couple of boo-boos in the system here because Dan made a couple of mistakes when we were doing the flush trimming, and I got a couple of dings or digs in the backside of the spars, unfortunately. So I'm doing some small spot repairs with CA glue and a little bit of dust and whatnot. And so for those areas, I start out with 80 grit, and I'll even start with the Rotex locked up so that it's a non-random orbital, and then switch it over to the random orbital with the 80 grit. Switch that up to the 150 grit and do the final sanding with 220 grit. So once the sanding is all done on the spars, I'm going to do the top and the foot plates. Same process again, but because these are pretty much ding-free and incident-free, and they're fairly good shape, 150 and 220 grit is about all I need to do. You'll probably notice that I haven't assembled these yet. That's because it's far easier to sand these things when they're disassembled and I can access all the surfaces than when they're assembled and working upside down in awkward positions and whatnot. Hey, so how do I know between the sanding grits when I'm ready to go on to the next grit? Sometimes I'll just take a pencil and lightly scribe across the top of the surface. And then I just completely sand the top again until all those pencil marks are gone. And you know you're finished. Unfortunately, there is a little bit of hand sanding that I need to do just to take off some of the furry edges. And so I just roll up a piece of hand grit, and I will again progress from 150 to 220 grit. Some more tips and bits and information from Dan and the stuff that I learned. I learned that burn marks suck because they go pretty deep and they're a pain in the ass to sand out, and hand sanding them really kind of sucks. It was unavoidable. So how did I get burn marks in here? It was because I had to use the router against the grain, so I had to do a climb cut in a couple of the pieces. When you do a climb cut, you gotta go slow, otherwise you're gonna tear out the end of the grain for sure. So if you're gonna all avoid getting burn marks, do. All right, another infamous Dan glue up. We're about to make a mess. Actually, no, it was really simple. The bottoms were simple. I just put a screw in there, screw holes, and screwed it on and glued it in place, and away we go. I can't do that to the top, obviously, because I don't want to put screw holes in my nice fancy top. So it's these block clamps to the rescue. Put a little glue on there, a couple of bar clamps, and away we go, I hope. So I got my bits and pieces, I got my bar clamps, I got my glue, I got my beaten stick, my persuader, and more liquid courage. Glue, glue, glue on the front, spread it around, make a mess, get lots all over everywhere. Now these pieces fit pretty tight already, so it does take a bit of persuasion with the persuader to sink it home. Put these bar clamps on. And if I was really smart, I would just put it on the easy way, but I'm not that smart, and it's a glue up. Oh, and gentle love taps. I love it when a plan comes together. Oh, forgot my liquid courage. Because I needed an upper body workout, I decided to start the finishing process by coating the bottom of the stands first while holding onto them precariously. Because I was not experiencing arm pop quite yet, I may as well coat the bottom side of the stands too so I don't have to bend over. Okay, now I can apply the varnish to the rest of the stand. I prefer a foam brush for the initial application. Yeah, so what I did on the first coat was basically coat it, let it sit for the 15 minutes, and then wipe it off, just like the manufacturer recommends. I am liking my decision to forego the maloof joint, as the through tenon looks more pleasing with contrasting colors. One thing I don't recommend on second coats is using a non-quite lint-free towel. I'm going to go to a cloth towel. The reason being is because in some spots on this, we've got some little blue fuzzies in there. It's easy enough to take out. The manufacturer suggests that you can sand between coats with 400 grit. So just a quick sand to get some of those blue fuzzies I left behind with 400 grit. Okay, everything looks good, everything feels good. We'll give it a quick blow off and we'll throw some more varnish on it. Second and subsequent coats, I'm going to put 4 total on, is going to be applied with a cloth, and it's going to be a wipe on and polish off. Rubbing on a coat. So I'm just going to dampen my freezer rag. So when you do a buff, you buff it in with circular motion to work it into the grain from all angles. You go around and around and around and around and around and around, and you buff it in. So I'm using the light at an angle, and I can see any dry or wet spots. So I let the product soak in for not too very long on the subsequent coats, so on the second, third, and fourth coat in my case. And then with the grain, wipe it off. So why am I putting on extra coats? It's because I like a little bit of luster in the finish. There it is. That's actually coat number 3 on that surface. I'm going to carry on and do the rest. You don't need to watch me. You get the point. Let me try that again.
Call them. They are 15 minutes away.
COVID. No COVID. Musings. I said musings. Oops. What a dummy. Jackass. Oh, who's a good Rex?